Now we're going to look at modifying text field attributes because we've already seen the functionality and some of the things we can do with the text itself. Now we're going to take a look at how to change the properties and attributes of it. So in this part we'll look at the attributes inspector rather than the code, but in the next part we'll be looking at how to modify these fields from the code itself. So our main focus will be on choosing colors both for the background and text, changing stuff like text fonts, and also changing sizing as well. Alright, so now we're going to take a look at how to modify some of the attributes of our text field. So we're going to pass on the viewController.swift right now. I'm just going to bring it all the way over to here. We're going to open up this side and we're going to focus mostly on the main.storyboard. Just going to decrease that, and in fact I can close up all the way there. I'm going to move that up here. So now let's modify some of our properties. So if we go to our text field and select it, we get all of our properties pulled up here. So first of all, just a few of these things. There's our documentation, and here's all the documentation on text views. It might be a good idea to read this. I'm not going to go through it because that's a good 10 to 15 minutes talking about just that, and you guys can read as well as I can. So I think it's a good idea to just go through and read this description afterwards, or maybe pause and read it now if you'd like. This one will just kind of tell us what class it is. In this case it's a UI text field. And this is the attributes inspector, and this is where we'll modify most of the properties. So we modify the appearance properties here, and then this is mostly for kind of sizing and margins. So one thing to note here is that I think the first thing I'm going to talk about is going to be that you see we can't modify the height. We can modify the width and the position, but not the height. So if we go back to the attributes inspector, the reason we can't do this is because of the border style that we've chosen. So this particular border style does not allow us to change the height. It's kind of a one-line text only. If we select this border, then we can change a height. This border allows us to change height, and no border allows us to change a height also. So very often, in fact most of the time, I'll go with no border. The reason being that although this is kind of nice, it kind of looks nice, we can again only enter only one line of text, and I can't modify the height. The other borders I don't really like so much personally, and the no border allows me to fully color things in as I like, so I'm just going to leave it as no border for now. In this way we can go back to the size inspector and modify the height. So if we want to modify the width, let's just set this to 20 and set this to 280. We can modify the values directly that way, or we can use these boxes to modify the size. And for this position, I'm just going to set this to 40, and for the height, I'll set it to 40 also. So going back to the attributes inspector, let's see what we can modify here. We can modify the text field if we'd like, but remember we have this placeholder text, and I'd rather not enter some text only to have to delete it. The next thing we can do is I'm just going to scroll down to the background. We can give it a background color. Now, there are a list of colors to choose from here, and these are my recently used colors. If we go to other, however, we have this large range of colors that we can choose from. So we can pick a pre-made color like this, or we can make a color this way, or pick one of these common ones, or again, choose the grayscale slider, or we can even choose a custom color from here as well. So if we just set the background to one of these, notice how the background color is changing up here. So common ones that I like to use are generally blues and greens, just because those are some of my favorite colors. And okay, there we go. So for now I'm just going to set it to this kind of midnight blue, and in fact I'm going to pick this aqua. That's a kind of a nice blue we've got going on there. Okay, now unfortunately, because of our color choice, the text becomes hard to read. Now one thing to note is that in iOS development, so in Swift versus in Android development, if you've seen our Xamarin Studio videos, then you'll know some more about Android development. The thing about iOS development is you cannot change the placeholder color. Okay, this is an unfortunate property that iOS hasn't chosen to enable, and that's to change the placeholder text color. So it's kind of always defaulted to be this a little dark, almost hard to see on anything other than a white or light background. We can, however, change the size and the font, just not the color itself. So let's go ahead and do that now. And actually, one thing to note, if you have a colored background, oftentimes if you select the light text color, it just gives you a lighter color, a lighter version of the same background color, and that makes for a really nice effect in my opinion. So there's all these other attributes, stretching, and so yeah, I don't really use stretching very much, and I don't really use these very much either because I don't go so much into the drawing. Alpha just kind of talks about how, or rather it represents how opaque your particular field is. And yeah, so on this note of the placeholder text, let's go and deal with the text. So this is probably, other than the background, the next most common attribute you'll modify usually. So we can change a text color. So let's go to other, and let's just set it to kind of like a dark, like a black or something. And again, notice how it doesn't change because this is placeholder text. If we did add some kind of text, so let's just say text for now, then you see it becomes black. We could have it as light blue, we could have it as yellow, an orange, or sorry, that's maraschino. We could have a maroon, a white, and in fact, I kind of like the white on there. Or should we go with a black? Let's go with a lead. So let's close that up, and I'm just going to delete the text because remember, I want the placeholder text rather than the text. So the next thing we'll look at is going to be alignment. It automatically defaults to this one, which sets everything to the left-hand side. Generally, I like to center my texts, but it really depends on what kind of a view you're going for with your app. We could add in a background image if we had one to add in. I don't have any artwork really on this computer, so I'm not going to do that. So other than the alignment and the text, let's go ahead and look at modifying the text itself. So notice how it's system 14.0, that's because we're just using the generic system font, and it's size 14. If we click on this T, then when we change this to custom, then we get this huge list of fonts that we can choose from. And I honestly don't know what all of them look like because I haven't used that many of them. There's a few that I like to stick with because I think they look good with all apps. But if you go online and search up the fonts in the, you could just perform a Google search on the Xcode 10 fonts, then you can get a list of what all of these look like. So, I'm not sure what Veranda looks like. One of the ones I like to use is Avenir, just because it's a nice, bold, kind of clean text. And the style allows us to choose whether we want it to be thick, or bold, or italicized, or whatever we want. Generally, black for Avenir is the thickest, heavy is pretty thick, and then medium, then book, then light, I believe, in that order. So I'm just going to select this as black for now, and that kind of makes the placeholder text easier to change. It's a little puzzling why the iOS developers haven't kind of enabled this placeholder text color modification, because you can modify every other attribute about it. But that's fine. So then we can change the size either by clicking on here, or we can enter in a size like 30. And there we go, it kind of fills up the entire box there. Okay, so this is how to modify attributes from our attributes inspector itself. Again, you can modify the size from the layout inspector or by clicking and dragging on these little boxes. Or we can go to the attributes inspector and kind of modify all of these attributes if we want. Again, capitalization we can change to capitalize all words. There's this autocorrect function if we want. We can do kind of spell checking. The keyboard type allows us to choose which kind of input. So you remember in our previous part we talked about the input being only basically a string that can be converted to a number. Well, it might be a good idea to change this kind of input to, or rather the keyboard type, to a numerical keyboard. And the reason being, we took our input and converted it to a double. Now, if there's a string input that has characters that are non-numerical, we get an error when we try to convert it to a double. So in this case, if we change it to some kind of a numerical keyboard, then it kind of eliminates that issue. So we could have a decimal pad, for example. And so then we can change the appearance, light or dark, and the return key kind of allows us to choose one of these functions to implement with our return key. Okay, and this just sets the alignment. We can set our state as selected, highlighted, or enabled. And yeah, many different properties you can modify here. So this is how to modify them using the Attributes Inspector. This is easy enough to do, as you can see the results right away. However, if we need to modify this only sets the attributes when the app runs. So unless the attributes are modified within the code, this is how everything's always going to look. This is always going to be this kind of aqua blue. The text is always going to be black because we set it to a black color here. Or rather it was lead, I think. And yeah, so the font's always going to be this size, this color, and everything else. So this is one of the downsides to changing everything within the Attributes Inspector, is that we can't change it once the code runs. What if we want to change things when the code runs? So what if we want to change colors, or text fonts, or backgrounds, or things like that? Well, that's why we can kind of, if we go back to our view controller, that's why we initialize these outlets that we did up here, because these allow us to modify the properties directly within the code itself. And that's what we'll be looking at in this part coming right up. It's going to be how to modify the attributes within the code. So now we've seen how to do it using the Attributes Inspector, but remember, this is only the default value when the app loads up and runs. If we want to change stuff while the app is running, we have to go into the code. And that's what we'll do now. In this part of the tutorial, we just modified the text field attributes. So we went to main.storyboard, selected our text field, and then looked at the attributes inspector. So we did stuff like we changed the sizing, and this was under the size inspector. Then we did stuff like changing the colors, like the background color and the text colors. We also changed stuff like the fonts, and looked at many other options that we can change within our text field. So these are attributes that do not change, and these properties will always be the same. So this means when the code runs, regardless of what happens in our app throughout the whole time it runs, these properties will always remain, will always have the same color, the same size, and the same font, unless we modify these properties in the code in some kind of function. And that's what we'll be looking at in this part coming right up.